Hello. Today we'll be talking about the Faraday cage, or otherwise known as basically a conductor uh, in a shell, and the idea is that the inside of that shell will always have zero electric field. Now, today's topics we're obviously talking about electric field, and some prerequisite knowledge that you might need is Gauss's law and E fields in general and what they are. So let's start with this question about a positive charge fixed at the center of a spherical neutral gray conducting shell. And we're asked basically what will be the charge configuration of that neutral shell. Um, Very quickly, we can deduce that the answer must be D here. And the idea is if we take the counterexamples, for example, E, right? We know that this spherical shell must have some E field pointing outwards, right? Use Gauss's law, right? Or just the idea that the electric field is equal to K times Q divided by R squared, right? And in that case, we have an induced charge where we must have a buildup of electrons being attracted to the positive charge on the inside. And because charge cannot be created or destroyed in most cases, there must be a equal and opposite amount of charge on the outside. Okay, that is the basic idea, right? Um, but let's say we were to give the counterexample in the charge configuration with something like B or C. So we see here that clearly these charges, they build up, and we know that like charges want to repel each other. So these charges want to move away from each other as fast as possible, right? We can think about, let's say this charge, it wants to move as far away as possible, right? And eventually, when the charges stop moving, you're gonna accumulate and have an equal distance from each other, right? So that's kind of how you can think. And for case A, we see that on the inside of the shell, well, we can't really have a imbalance of attraction on the inside because here again the electrons want to move as far away from each other as possible, right? So they're going to evenly distribute. Not only that, the force of attraction, let's say between this charge and this electron over here, they must be equal and opposite just because of the KQQ divided by R squared formula, right? So there's kind of two ways you can think about it. You can think about the individual interaction on the electron and the um, overall concept of like charges repel and opposite charges attract, right? Moving on to the second case where we have a off-center spherical shell. Now this question is a little bit harder because, as I said, like charges attract, like charges repel, and like opposite charges attract. So you might be tempted to think, oh, it might be a case like B or C, right? Um, but we know for sure that like it cannot be E, is the charges inside, well, just like the previous case, right? They're gonna kind of want to move, kind of um, like cancel out the E field with the positive charge, right? They're not going to just have no effect on each other. There will be movement of electrons, and from that we will have a induced charge somewhere along. Okay. Now with that being said, it really can't be D, right? Because um, well, the D configuration only works if the charge is directly in the center because there's a stronger force attracting on some parts than the other. Okay, so we have this case of A, B, and C. Now the answer is actually A, and let me prove that to you. So with that, I'm going to take the counterexample of B. So let's take B, let's charge B, and we see that there's a positive charge on the off center on the inside. There's a positive charge, and there's corresponding negative charge on the inside that accumulates here along the edges and spreads out on the back. Right, very dense on the inside. And then we see a corresponding positive charge on the outside, very densely packed as well. and that tends to spread out a little bit as we move away. Now, initially, you might be like, well, this configuration makes sense, right? Well, the negative electrons want to move towards the positive charge, right? And it's closest to the edge on the right, so more electrons must accumulate on the right. And because of that, the positive charge also wants to move towards the negative charge, right? Because they're attracted to it. Opposite charges attract. But in this case, if we zoom in on this boundary over here on the right, we see that this case probably is not accurate. Right? We have this wall, and then we have positive charge on the outside and negative charge on the inside. Well, if this was to happen, right, we see that this is a conductor, so electrons can move freely throughout the conducting shell, and in this case, there's nothing stopping the electrons and positive charge just combining each other, right? They just combine, right? There's nothing stopping them from moving, and this will create a case where we have a neutral. We're back to neutral, right? All the charges combine, and we have a net zero charge. And that goes against our counterexample of E, right? We know that for sure there's going to be some kind of charge accumulation, so it cannot be a neutral wall, right? So that's the idea of that. And very similarly, we can take that with the example C, right? So we take the sphere, take the positive charge on the middle, and then, or off center, sorry, charges accumulate towards the right side and spread out towards the back. And the positive charges are spread out on the right this time, but then grouped up densely on the left side and spread back out as we move to the right. Okay. Now I want to focus on the left side of this shell. Okay. So we have this wall, we have the positive dense charges on the left, and then we have the less populated negative charge on the left as well, in the inner surface. Here we can use the idea that, well, like charges really like to repel, and we see that these charges are really close to each other, right? So they must want to move away from each other as possible, right? As far away from, and we know from the superposition principle, right, that yes, there's this positive charge over here that may affect the positive charge on the left, and it wants to move away from the positive charge. But we see that the radius, right, the distance between this positive charge on the off center is much farther than the interactions of the positive charges inside, right? So based on the superposition principle, the closest charges have more power, right? Based off the inverse square law, right? Q over R squared. That then these charges must repel each other much stronger than this positive charge, right? So again, we will come into this configuration of, well, these charges move away, and I'm just going to focus on the surface this time. They're going to want to move away from each other as fast as possible, right? So we're not in electrostatic, like we don't have electric static yet, right? These charges still want to move away from each other. So this gives us the last scenario where, well, we know for sure that there's a uneven accumulation of charge on the inside of the sphere that spreads out because there's a positive charge on the inside off center. And then this leads to our case, right? The positive charge, they accumulate on the surface, but they want to move as far away from each other as possible, right? Let's take one of the scenarios of, let's say, B, right? If we take B, for example, let's start with the charges close by. All right, less so here, less so here. And these charges want to move away from each other, right? So let's just take these charges. They want to move away from each other. So we're just going to become a case where we have a evenly distributed charge on the outside, right? Yeah, because these charges won't combine with the negative charge on the inside. Otherwise, that violates our case of having electrostatic equilibrium. And also, we can use another method. So let's take, if you're familiar with Gauss's law, the idea is if you take a Gaussian surface, a closed Gaussian surface, and you have a symmetry, um, the charge inside, the E field is equal to the charge inside divided by epsilon naught, right? So let's do that. Let's take the case where we have or we can just reuse this shell, Gauss's law. So let's take our shell, I'm gonna use green, so Gauss's law. And I'm going to draw a concentric sphere around this charge, okay? And what that tells me is that there's an E field that's leaving the Gaussian surface with the charge of positive Q or whatever, right? Okay, so let's take my next Gaussian surface. So we know just around the positive charge, there's some kind of E field pointing outwards. Okay. Now let's take the Gaussian surface of only the inner surface and the positive charge. Here we see that we have a net charge of 0, right? The negative charge on the inside is equivalent to the positive charge on the inside of the um, Faraday cage, right? So this must mean the E field is 0, so we have no radial E field outwards or inwards, right? Moving on, let's take the final Gaussian surface, right? Our conductor was originally neutral, and we only place a positive charge on the inside. That must mean that we only have the E field of a positive charge. So we take the same E field, the same radial E field, pointing outwards, as if we only took that charge from the inside. Right? This is what explains the phenomenon that we see, right? All these E fields are, if we take a perfect sphere, we're going to have a evenly distributed E field, right? So that's the basic idea of having a Faraday cage, and if you have a charge moving on the inside, that on the surface we really don't see a difference. This won't change no matter where the position is for the positive charge on the inside or even negative charge. The only difference would be if it's a negative charge, the field lines would be pointing inwards instead. But if the charge is moving on the inside, as long as it's not touching the boundary or anything like that, we already know that, well, the E fields must cancel out eventually. And if we have a configuration where the E fields don't cancel out, then the Faraday cage is not in static equilibrium for charges, right? The electrons will want to move or something like that. So this gives us our final answer that the charged shell must be A. Okay. So that is our lesson for today for Gauss's law, especially Faraday cages. And I hope to see you soon.